The quiet clinking of forks against plates filled the heavy silence that hung over our usual Wednesday night dinner. I glanced up from my untouched meal, my eyes landing on Rowan, my husband of 6 years. He avoided my gaze, eating his pasta with an urgency that seemed anything but normal. I searched his face, desperate to catch even a glimpse of the man I had fallen in love with, but all I saw was someone who felt like a stranger. Then I noticed it, his phone, sitting carelessly next to his plate. The screen lit up, the notification flashing as if taunting me. My hands moved before my mind could stop them. Rowan didn't even flinch when I grabbed his phone and swiped the unlock code, his obliviousness almost insulting. The message was simple, yet it hit me like a freight train. Can't wait to feel you inside me again. Meet at our place in an hour. The sender's name glared back at me. Marcella. I read it again and again, the words clawing their way into my mind until they became impossible to ignore. It all made sense now, his late nights, his distracted demeanor, the inexplicable distance that had crept into our marriage. I tried to convince myself that he was just tired, overworked. I'd been so naive. Everything okay, honey? Rowan's voice broke through my thoughts, deceptively calm, like he wasn't the villain sitting across from me. I didn't answer. Instead, I slid his phone across the table, watching his face carefully. The color drained from his cheeks as his eyes flickered to the screen. For the first time in months, his carefully constructed mask slipped, and there it was, panic. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Alara, I can explain, he stammered, his voice uneven as he scrambled for excuses. I held up a hand, silencing him before he could start weaving another lie. My voice trembled, but I refused to let it break. Just one thing, Rowan. How long? For a moment, he looked like he might lie again. Then, defeated, his shoulders sagged. 6 months, he muttered. 6 months. Half a year of betrayal, deceit, and a life I thought we were building together. 6 months of me carrying on, blissfully unaware that the man I shared my bed with was busy tearing our marriage apart. Who is she? I demanded, though the name Marcella echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. His bitter chuckle made my blood boil. Does it really matter? She's someone who makes me feel alive. Things I haven't felt in years. His words sliced through me like knives, shredding what was left of my heart. Alive. I wanted to scream, to throw the nearest plate at him, to demand how I hadn't been enough. But I refused to give him that satisfaction. He didn't deserve my tears. Slowly, deliberately, I rose from my chair. My hands trembled as I grabbed my purse, but I held my head high. I wouldn't break, not in front of him. Rowan watched me with that same stunned expression, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. He should have known better. I didn't look back as I walked toward the door. He might have destroyed our marriage, but he wouldn't destroy me. Not completely. Excuse me? I hissed, my voice trembling from the effort it took not to lunge at her. Pathetic? That's the word you use for the man you've been crawling into bed with for months. Marcella shrugged, a cruel glint in her dark eyes. Call it what you want. He clearly wasn't happy with you. And that's not my problem. Her words sliced through me like a blade, sharper than anything Rowan had said to my face. This woman, this smug, silk-draped caricature, had the audacity to dismiss me while standing in an apartment my husband had paid for. Anger surged, hotter than I had ever felt, drowning out the heartbreak that had left me in tears the past few nights. You're a parasite, I snapped, my voice venomous. Feeding off someone else's life while pretending you're something special. Let's get one thing straight, Marcella. You didn't win anything. He's not a prize, and you're just his latest mistake. Her smirk faltered, just for a second, but I saw it. Good. I wanted her to feel even an ounce of the humiliation she'd so gleefully dished out. You sound bitter, she shot back, recovering quickly. No wonder Rowan wanted out. I took a step closer, my voice lowering to a calm, almost dangerous tone. You think you know him? That he's some untouchable dream you've got wrapped around your little finger? Let me ask you something, Marcella. Did he tell you about the other women? The flicker of doubt in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. I smiled coldly, savoring the tiny crack I had made in her confidence. That's right, I continued, pressing my advantage. You're not the only one. Rowan's been screwing his way through half the city while you sat here thinking you were the center of his world. You're nothing more than another stop on his pathetic little tour of betrayal. She paled, her arms crossing defensively over her chest. You're lying. I laughed bitterly. Am I? Because I've got the proof, emails, photos, credit card receipts. Rowan's business trips, hotels, women, plural. Marcella's lips parted as though to argue, but no words came out. For the first time, her confidence wavered, and she looked small, insignificant in the opulence that surrounded her. You might want to start packing, I said coldly, because when I'm done with Rowan, neither of you will have a single cent left to keep you comfortable. I turned and walked to the door, leaving her standing in the center of her glittering cage, exposed and shaken. I didn't stop until I was outside, where the cool air hit my flushed face like a shock of reality. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind a whirl of emotions, fury, satisfaction, and a bittersweet ache I couldn't quite name. Marcella might have thought she could humiliate me, but she didn't know who she was dealing with. Rowan, on the other hand, he would soon find out. As I climbed into my car, my hands gripped the steering wheel with a new resolve. Rowan's betrayal had broken me, but not for long. I wasn't going to let him, or anyone else, reduce me to a victim. I would fight back. I would take my life, my dignity, and every ounce of what he owed me. And when I was done, Rowan and Marcella would both regret the day they thought they could destroy me. You had me trapped, Alara, Rowan shot back, his voice sharp and defensive. This marriage was suffocating me. I needed an escape. I blinked, stunned by his audacity. Trapped? He was the one who had promised forever. He was the one who had stood beside me, looking into my eyes, vowing to love me in sickness and in health. And now, he had the gall to blame me for his betrayal? Suffocating you? I repeated, my voice trembling. I cooked, cleaned, supported you. I sacrificed my dreams so you could build your career. And this is how you repay me. Rowan sneered, shaking his head as if I were the unreasonable one. You don't get it. I haven't been happy for years, Alara. At least Marcella makes me feel alive. Marcella. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. Marcella is a symptom, Rowan, not a solution. You want to feel alive? Try being honest. Try building something real instead of hiding behind cheap thrills and lies. He stepped closer, his anger flaring. Oh, spare me the lecture. You're just bitter because I found someone better. I froze, his words hitting harder than any slap. Someone better. After everything I'd done for him, every piece of myself I'd poured into our marriage, this was what he thought of me? My anger, white-hot moments ago, cooled into something sharper, cold resolve. Better? I echoed softly, my voice unnervingly calm. Oh, Rowan, you have no idea what you've just done. For the first time, his bravado cracked. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm done, I said, turning on my heel. Done being your doormat. Done watching you gamble away our life on empty promises and broken trust. Alara. No, I whirled around, cutting him off. You want out? You've got it. But don't think for a second I'm walking away quietly. I'll take everything you care about, starting with this house, my money, and your reputation. Rowan stared at me, his confidence faltering. I saw it. The realization that I wasn't the same woman who had tiptoed around his moods for years. I was done playing the dutiful wife. He had lit this fire, and now he was going to burn in it. You're making a mistake, he growled, desperation seeping into his voice.
No, Rowan.
You made the mistake. I grabbed the damning documents scattered across the floor, clutching them like ammunition. I'll see you in court. I turned and walked upstairs, each step more decisive than the last.
He didn't follow me.
He didn't dare. Maybe for the first time in his life. Rowan realized he'd underestimated me. In the sanctuary of my room, I began drafting my plan. I called my lawyer, prepared for the fight ahead. Rowan thought he could discard me, but he was wrong. I wouldn't just survive. I would thrive. And when this was over, he'd be left with nothing but the wreckage of his own betrayal. Diane leaned back in her chair, her eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. This is the kind of case divorce attorneys dream about. Financial misconduct, multiple affairs, and a fool too arrogant to cover his tracks? Rowan just handed us a loaded weapon. I exhaled, tension momentarily lifting from my shoulders. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I wasn't completely powerless. What's our next step? I asked, steadying my voice. Diane slid the papers neatly back into the folder and tapped her manicured nails against the desk. First, we freeze any joint accounts to stop him from funneling more money to his mistress, or mistresses in this case. She smirked. Men like Rowan love to think they're clever, but they always get sloppy. Next, we petition the court for spousal support and lock in a temporary restraining order on all marital assets. That includes any investments, bank accounts, cars, and property he thinks he owns. I couldn't suppress the sharp satisfaction that surged through me. And the house. Yours, Diane said firmly. The deed is clear. He can stomp around all he likes, but legally, he's got no claim to it. That's your strongest leverage. Hearing her confirm it felt like a lifeline, a small, unshakable truth I could cling to amid the chaos. My father's distrust of Rowan, which I once resented, had now turned into my greatest advantage. Thank you, Dad, I thought silently. What about Marcella? I pressed, Rowan's mistress's name tasting bitter on my tongue. Can we expose her part in this mess? Diane raised a brow, considering it. If she's benefiting financially from his misdeeds, we can subpoena her bank records. Don't worry, we'll pull her name into this, and she won't like it one bit. People like her are great at smiling in silk robes, but they tend to unravel when dragged into court. I nodded, feeling a fire in my chest that had been smoldering since the moment I read Marcella's text. Rowan thought he'd won, parading around with a woman half his age, while I was supposed to crumble quietly. But he had underestimated me, underestimated how much fight I still had left. When can we start? I asked, my voice cold and resolute. Diane's grin widened, a reflection of the storm building inside me. We start today. I'll file the necessary motions this afternoon. Rowan won't see this coming. I left Diane's office with a renewed sense of purpose. The folder of evidence clutched tightly in my hand. This wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't about ruining Rowan's life for the sake of spite, although I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a satisfying bonus. This was about reclaiming my dignity. It was about holding Rowan accountable for the years he chipped away at my trust, my happiness, and the life I had built. When I arrived back at the house, my house, I found Rowan sitting on the couch, his legs casually sprawled, as though he still owned a piece of my life. He looked up, his face darkening at the sight of me. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply. "Shouldn't you be at your sister's or something? I figured you'd run off by now." I stepped closer, standing tall, the folder still firm in my grasp. "Oh, Rowan," I said, my voice smooth as glass. "I'm not going anywhere. You are." His face paled slightly, though he tried to mask it with his usual smug arrogance. "What are you talking about?" I dropped the folder onto the coffee table in front of him. "Everything's in here, Rowan. Every affair, every financial transaction, every lie. I've already retained a lawyer. And we're coming after you. For everything." He rifled through the documents, his hands shaking ever so slightly as realization dawned. "This is ridiculous." "It's over, Rowan," I interrupted, cutting through his denial like a blade. "You wanted a divorce? You've got it. But you're not walking away with a damn thing except the consequences of your actions." Rowan shot up from the couch, his expression contorted with fury. "You can't do this to me, Alara." "Actually, I can. You've already done it to yourself." I turned to walk upstairs. pausing at the base of the staircase to deliver the final blow. "Pack your things, Rowan. Diane Hastings will be in touch, and when this is all over, you won't have Marcella or a penny to your name." He stared after me, speechless for once in his life. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I had no doubt he'd rant and rave, maybe even throw one of his pathetic tantrums, but none of it mattered. I had already won the war. He didn't even realize he'd started. As I reached my bedroom, I glanced out the window, where the first light of dusk was settling over the horizon. The darkness Rowan had cast over my life was lifting. For the first time in years, I felt like I was reclaiming control, not just over my future, but over myself. Rowan had thought I would be weak, that I would crumble. But he forgot that sometimes betrayal doesn't break a woman, it makes her unshakable. And when the dust settled, I would be standing tall, stronger than ever. While he disappeared into the wreckage of his own making. Their pathetic attempts to paint me as the villain only made me laugh, though the sound was sharp and hollow, devoid of the warmth it once held. Rowan was grasping at straws, desperate to salvage what little reputation he had left. But Diane dismantled every baseless accusation with surgical precision. When his lawyer presented evidence of my alleged affairs, grainy photos of me meeting friends for coffee or sitting in my car outside the grocery store, Diane didn't even flinch. She calmly stood, adjusting her blazer as if preparing to deliver a punchline. "Your Honor," she began, holding up the stack of absurd photos. "It's fascinating that the defendant seems to have such an interest in stalking my client's every move, yet he couldn't spare an ounce of that energy to remain faithful to her during their marriage." Rowan's face turned crimson as the courtroom erupted into muffled snickers. His lawyer looked as if he might spontaneously combust from embarrassment. Diane, ever the composed professional, turned to sit beside me, her lips curving into a satisfied smile. "We've got him," she whispered. And she was right. Rowan's case was crumbling faster than he could scramble to save it. With every passing hearing, more and more of his misdeeds came to light. Hidden bank accounts, exorbitant wire transfers to Marcella, and even a rental agreement for a second apartment in her name. Diane ensured every shred of evidence, painted a damning portrait of a man who had systematically betrayed not only his marriage, but his own integrity. As for Marcella, Diane had been relentless in pursuing her involvement. By subpoenaing bank records and business expenses, we uncovered that Rowan had been funneling tens of thousands of dollars into projects for Marcella's so-called interior design business, money that she conveniently withdrew almost immediately. When Diane presented the findings in court, Rowan's face went slack, and I relished every moment. Marcella hadn't shown up in support. In fact, she'd gone conspicuously silent, no doubt realizing her glittering facade was about to collapse. "You should know," Diane whispered to me after the hearing, "Marcella's already reached out to negotiate a statement. She's throwing Rowan under the bus to save herself." I couldn't help but smile, a cold, triumphant smile that reflected every ounce of betrayal and pain I'd endured. The woman who once mocked me in her silk robe would soon be reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. The day of the final settlement hearing, Rowan looked like a shadow of the man I once knew. His expensive suits were rumpled, his hair no longer perfectly styled, and there were deep circles under his eyes, perhaps from the sleepless nights he spent watching his life implode. I didn't feel pity. He had built this reality brick by brick, and now he had to live in it. When the judge delivered the ruling, my heart pounded in anticipation. Given the overwhelming evidence of Mr. Davies's financial misconduct, adultery, and breach of marital trust, this court awards Mrs. Davies full ownership of the family home, a significant portion of the defendant's remaining assets, and ongoing alimony payments. Rowan slumped in his chair, defeated. He shot me a look, half pleading, half furious, but I met it with nothing but calm indifference. He had already taken so much from me, but I wouldn't let him take a shred more. A month later, the house was mine again, not just on paper but in spirit. I walked through the quiet rooms, each corner a reminder of the life I once thought I had. But instead of lingering on the pain, I let it go. I'd purged the house of Rowan's memory, Every photo, every trace of his presence gone. The space felt lighter, freer, like it was finally mine. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the living room windows, I found myself standing in the doorway with a cup of coffee, looking out into the yard. The sound of my phone buzzing broke the silence. It was Diane. "You'll want to hear this," she said, amusement evident in her voice. "Marcella's business has been seized to pay back the funds Rowan funneled into it."
And Rowan?
"He's declaring bankruptcy." I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the words settle like a balm on an old wound. "Good," I replied simply. "Good? That's all you have to say?" Diane teased. I smiled faintly. "What else is there? I got my justice. He lost everything. And now I can finally move on." Rowan's downfall was complete. The man who once looked down on me, dismissing my worth and destroying our marriage, was now left with nothing. No mistress, no money, and no one to blame but himself. As for me, I was free. Free to rebuild, to heal, and to reclaim the life I deserved. I set my coffee cup down and stepped outside into the fresh air. For the first time in years, I felt light, unburdened by the weight of betrayal and anger. The chapter with Rowan was closed, and in its place, a new beginning waited. I had fought for my dignity, for justice, and I had won. And that, more than anything, was worth every tear, every battle, and every ounce of strength it took to get here. The pieces were set. Marcella, with her web of lies, and Rowan, a fool blinded by lust and arrogance, were about to watch their fragile kingdom crumble. Every document, every photograph, every damning detail was ready to be unleashed like a tidal wave of reckoning. Diane grinned through the phone, her voice cool and razor-sharp. "Oh, we're more than ready, Alara. Rowan and Marcella won't know what hit them." We executed the plan with the precision of a perfectly orchestrated symphony. The investigator leaked carefully selected pieces of evidence to Mr. Woodrow's inner circle, photos of Marcella leaving his condo, screenshots of flirtatious texts, and call logs that exposed just how deep their connection ran. The businessman's wife, a woman known for her public poise and ruthless control of her image, didn't take long to react. Whispers spread like wildfire across their high society circles, painting Marcella as nothing more than a gold-digging snake slithering from one wealthy man to the next. Soon enough, it wasn't just Mrs. Woodrow watching the evidence pile up, it was Rowan, too. The footage, painstakingly compiled by my investigator, arrived at Rowan's doorstep like a poisoned gift. A thick, unassuming manila envelope filled with high-definition photos of Marcella stepping out of Mr. Woodrow's luxury car, clinging to his arm at exclusive events, slipping out of the mogul's condo late at night. Each image perfectly timed to leave no room for doubt. To twist the knife deeper, it was hand-delivered during Rowan's lunch hour at his office, ensuring maximum humiliation as his colleagues exchanged knowing glances. Days later, Diane called me with the latest update, her voice practically giddy. "You're going to love this." Rowan called off the engagement. I couldn't stop the cruel smile that spread across my face. Did he really think Marcella was loyal to him? "Oh, it gets better," Diane continued, a note of triumph in her voice. "Apparently, he confronted her in the lobby of her building. Witnesses say it was a screaming match. She called him a pathetic husband, and he accused her of using him like a piggy bank. It ended with her throwing a drink in his face." A deep, satisfied laugh escaped me. Rowan's delusions of Marcella's undying love had finally shattered. And I could picture the scene perfectly, his pride crumbling as the woman he'd risked everything for publicly humiliated him. He'd traded a marriage and a home for the illusion of excitement, only to be discarded like yesterday's trash. "Any word on Mr. Woodrow?" I asked, still savoring Rowan's downfall. Diane chuckled. "Mrs. Woodrow filed for divorce and froze her husband's accounts. That man won't be funding anyone's silk robes or luxury apartments anytime soon." It was a brisk, clear morning when I saw Rowan for the first time in weeks. He showed up at the house, my house, unannounced, looking disheveled and hollow. The arrogance that once defined him had been replaced with something pitiful, something desperate. I opened the door just wide enough to face him, arms crossed. "What do you want, Rowan?" His shoulders slumped. "I made a mistake, Alara." I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "Only one?" He exhaled, the sound shaky. "I messed up. Marcella, she wasn't what I thought she was. I thought I could start over, but I see now that I had everything I needed with you." I stared at him for a long moment, savoring the sight of his downfall. The man who once lorded his superiority over me now looked small, broken. "Everything you needed?" I repeated, my tone icy. "You needed to lie, cheat, and steal? You needed to humiliate me and throw our marriage away for a woman who tossed you aside the moment a better offer came along." He flinched, unable to meet my gaze. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was lost. "No," I said, my voice sharp and unwavering. "You weren't lost, Rowan. You were selfish. You made your choices, and now you get to live with them." His face crumpled, as if he'd finally realized there would be no forgiveness, no redemption for what he'd done. "Please, Alara. I just want another chance." I let the silence hang, my heart unmoved by his pleas. I thought of Lucas, the investigator's reports, the hours spent crying over his betrayal. I thought of the satisfaction I felt as his life imploded, every thread of his lies unraveling in spectacular fashion. And I thought of the strength I'd found in myself, strength that he could no longer diminish. "You don't get another chance," I said coldly, stepping back and shutting the door in his face. As the weeks passed, I focused on rebuilding my life. The house was mine, the settlement from the divorce generous enough to ensure financial freedom, and Rowan? He faded into irrelevance, his reputation permanently tarnished. People whispered about the man who destroyed his own life for nothing, a cautionary tale of greed and recklessness. I'd won, not just in the courtroom, but in reclaiming my dignity, my independence, and my future. For all the pain he caused, Rowan taught me a lesson I would never forget. I deserved more. And I would never again settle for less. Standing in my garden one evening, I breathed in the crisp air, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The shadows stretched long, but I didn't fear them. I had faced the darkness, torn it apart, and emerged stronger. Rowan and Marcella's empire of lies lay in ruins, but I was finally free. Rowan's perfect little world, the one he had destroyed our marriage for, was crumbling before his eyes. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. He took a half-step toward Marcella, his hand lifting uselessly as if to intervene, but Miranda's voice cut him down like a blade. "And you?" she spat, rounding on Rowan with a venomous glare. "I don't know whether to pity you or laugh at how pathetically blind you've been. Did you really think she was only yours?" Rowan's face twisted, his mask of arrogance faltering as whispers continued to ripple through the crowd. The room had turned into a theater of scandal, and everyone around us was riveted, their champagne forgotten as the drama unfolded in real time. Diane leaned closer, murmuring just loud enough for me to hear, "I don't think they'll be inviting either of them to next year's gala." I smothered a laugh, my gaze fixed on Marcella, who stood at the center of the chaos, disheveled, humiliated, and utterly exposed. Her smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by tears of rage and shame as she stumbled back, clutching the remnants of her torn gown. "I'm calling security," she shrieked, her voice raw. "This is slander, all lies." Miranda laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed off the ballroom walls. "Oh, please. The photos don't lie, sweetheart. Neither do the hotel receipts. I have lawyers on retainer who will make sure you don't see a single dime out of this." She turned back to the crowd, her voice booming. "And that goes for anyone thinking of trusting this little gold digger with so much as their dry cleaning bill." A ripple of laughter passed through the guests, mingled with gasps and hushed whispers. Marcella's desperation turned feral as she spun toward Rowan, her face red with fury. "This is your fault," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at him. "I left everything for you. And now look what you've done. You were supposed to protect me. Rowan blinked, his mouth opening as though to argue, but no words came out. The crowd's attention turned to him, waiting for a response he couldn't muster. I knew him too well. His fragile ego couldn't handle being made a fool of, especially in public. For all his bravado, Rowan was just as weak as the pedestal I'd once placed him on. The silence stretched painfully until Rowan finally muttered, "Marcella, what is this? You told me." "Oh, don't you dare turn this on me," Marcella shouted, her voice cracking. "You're no better. You're broke, Rowan. I've been keeping this farce afloat for months. Rowan's face drained of the last shred of color. The whispers grew louder, guests exchanging glances, their gazes flicking between Marcella and Rowan like spectators at a prize fight. Even I wasn't expecting her to detonate his dignity so thoroughly. "You're broke?" A man's voice echoed across the crowd, a business associate perhaps. Rowan's reputation as a charming, successful professional was collapsing faster than his pride. Marcella let out a broken laugh. "Oh, did he not tell you? He gambled his savings away long before I ever showed up. You're nothing but a washed-up loser, Rowan." The crowd gasped collectively as the final nail was driven into Rowan's coffin. I stood there, silent and composed, my expression neutral as I watched Rowan unravel. His face twisted, his jaw tight, but the humiliation on display was too much for him to combat. I could see it in his eyes. He was done. Finished. Miranda, clearly satisfied, turned on her heel and stormed out of the ballroom with all the poise of a woman who knew she had won. Marcella stood there, tears streaking her ruined makeup, as the crowd began to disperse, the whispers growing quieter now that the carnage was complete. Rowan finally turned his head, his gaze locking onto me. The sheer venom in his expression might have shaken me once, but not anymore. This time, I met his glare with an icy smile, a silent acknowledgement that I had been the architect of his undoing. I tilted my head, my voice soft and sweet as I spoke, just loud enough for him to hear. "You should have been more careful with what you threw away, Rowan. Actions have consequences." His fists clenched, but he said nothing. What could he say? I had already taken everything. The marriage he'd shattered, the reputation he prided himself on, the mistress he'd thrown it all away for. It was gone. I turned to Diane, who beamed with satisfaction. "Shall we?" she asked, her tone light as though we'd just finished a pleasant evening out. "Let's," I replied, slipping my clutch under my arm. As we walked out of the ballroom, the murmur of voices and the distant sound of Marcella's sobs followed us. I stepped out into the crisp night air, breathing it in as though I could finally exhale for the first time in months. Diane broke the silence. "That was spectacular. Better than I imagined," I admitted. And it was true. Watching Rowan and Marcella's carefully constructed world collapse felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, my strength, my dignity, my peace. "Where to next?" Diane asked, smirking. I smiled faintly. "Home." For the first time, it was my home, free of lies, betrayal, and Rowan's shadow. And as I left that ballroom, the echoes of my vengeance fading behind me, I realized that the war was over. And I had won. I tilted my head slightly, pretending to consider his pathetic display as Diane sat beside me, a silent but formidable presence. Rowan's eyes darted to her, as if her steely gaze alone was enough to strip away what remained of his tattered dignity. "I don't need your apologies, Rowan," I said coolly, my voice devoid of the emotion he was so clearly fishing for. "I needed your loyalty, your respect, both of which you tossed away the moment you decided she was worth risking everything for." He flinched, his hand clenching the edge of the table as though bracing himself against the weight of his own shame. "I made a mistake. I lost my way." I laughed, cutting him off. "A mistake? A mistake is forgetting our anniversary. A mistake is burning dinner. What you did, Rowan, wasn't a mistake.
It was a choice.
A deliberate choice, one you made over and over again." His mouth opened as though to argue, but he seemed to think better of it. Instead, he dropped his gaze to the table. "I thought Marcella was different," he mumbled. I scoffed. She was different, all right. She played you like a fiddle. I leaned forward, my tone turning icy. Did you really think someone like her would settle for you, Rowan? She's already moved on to her next victim, while you're left sitting here, broke and humiliated. Diane's pen clicked audibly as she tapped it against her pristine legal pad, her voice cutting in like a scalpel. Mr. Davies, we aren't here for emotional reunions. We're here to finalize the terms of the divorce. She glanced over at me. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to prolong this discussion. I shook my head.
No.
Let's finish what we started. Rowan looked up, his face crumbling with defeat. Please, Alara. I don't want to lose everything. I stared at him for a long moment, my heart cold and unyielding. You lost everything the moment you betrayed me, Rowan. Don't blame me for the consequences of your own actions. Diane slid the settlement agreement across the table, a document Rowan had no choice but to sign. As discussed, she said crisply, you'll surrender your share of the house and the savings accounts. The court has granted Mrs. Davies significant alimony and damages based on your financial misconduct. Rowan's hand trembled as he picked up the pen, his eyes darting between the paperwork and my impassive face. I watched him sign each page, his movements slow and pained, as though every stroke of the pen was chiseling another crack into his already broken ego. When the final signature was in place, Diane neatly gathered the documents and stood. Congratulations, Mrs. Davies, she said, her smile sharp and triumphant. You're officially free. I rose as well, smoothing down the front of my blazer. It's over, Rowan, I said quietly, looking down at him one last time. I hope the price of your happiness was worth it. He didn't respond, and for the first time in our marriage, or whatever semblance remained of it, I saw Rowan exactly for what he was: weak, selfish, and utterly hollow. I turned and left the office without a backward glance, Diane's heels clicking confidently beside mine. As I stepped out into the sunlight, a wave of relief washed over me. It wasn't just about vengeance, it never had been. This was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my power. Rowan had underestimated me. They all had. And now I was free, unburdened, ready to rebuild my future on my terms. You're smiling, Diane observed, tucking the paperwork into her leather bag.
Ikke si om I replid.
Inhaling deeply as though tasting freedom for the first time. This feels good. You should celebrate, she said, her smirk softening into something almost warm. You've earned it. And I had. I'd survived betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak, but I hadn't just survived, I'd won. No more looking back. No more mourning what had been. I was ready to embrace what could be. As I walked away, the weight of my old life falling from my shoulders, I whispered under my breath, You did this to yourself, Rowan. And I'm just getting started. 6 months later, I barely thought about him. The weight of his betrayal no longer sat heavy on my chest. It had turned into something else, a quiet resolve, a lesson learned, and a promise to never let anyone hold power over me again. I stood in the doorway of my newly renovated living room, the sunlight pouring through the bay window and warming the fresh paint on the walls. It was a space that felt entirely mine, every carefully chosen detail reflecting the woman I had become. Where once I saw remnants of Rowan's influence, there were now only symbols of independence and renewal. The soft hum of my phone broke the silence, a message from Diane lighting up the screen. Final paperwork processed. The last of the asset transfers is officially complete. Cheers to you, Alara, you won. I smiled faintly, slipping the phone into my pocket. Winning didn't feel like a dramatic triumph anymore. It felt like peace. Later that evening, as I sat curled up with a book and a cup of chamomile tea, the doorbell rang. A visitor at this hour was rare, and instinctively, a ripple of unease skated down my spine. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Rowan. It wasn't anyone I expected. Samantha stood there, her once polished veneer replaced with something duller, wearier. Her expression lacked its former smugness. Instead, it was edged with exhaustion and resignation. What do you want? I asked, my voice flat and steady. She had no place in my life, and we both knew it. "I don't blame you for hating me," she said softly, her words a sharp contrast to the woman I had confronted in that lavish apartment. I wanted to say you were right." I crossed my arms, the bitterness I thought I had buried threatening to bubble to the surface. "About what, exactly?" "About Rowan." She looked down, shaking her head. "He promised me a future, fed me lies about his money, his success. But after everything fell apart, I realized he didn't have anything left to give me, or anyone else. He's ruined." For a moment, I considered her words. Part of me wanted to gloat, to rub salt in her wounds as she had done to me when I first learned of her betrayal. But all I felt was indifference. "That's not my problem," I replied firmly. "You made your choices, Samantha. You're as complicit in his downfall as he is." "I know," she whispered, stepping back from the door. "I just thought you deserved to know. He lost everything." I tilted my head slightly, letting the meaning settle. Rowan had lost everything: his reputation, his wealth, his allies, and the women he used to distract himself from the mess he'd created. It was poetic in a way, but hearing it brought me no joy. "Thanks for stopping by," I said, my tone cool. "But this chapter of my life is closed. You and Rowan belong to the past now. And that's where I'm keeping you." Her gaze lingered for a moment before she nodded, defeated. "Take care of yourself, Alara." As she walked back to her car, I closed the door, the sound of it latching feeling like the final nail in the coffin of my old life. Samantha's words echoed in my mind. He lost everything. And yet, I gained everything that mattered. My freedom, my peace, and a future I was proud to call my own. The next morning, I stood barefoot on my porch, sipping my coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. The garden I'd begun planting months ago was starting to bloom, roses, lavender, and marigolds reaching toward the light. My father always told me that flowers were a sign of resilience, a reminder that beauty could emerge from even the harshest storms. I smiled, kneeling to brush the petals of a yellow rose. Rowan's name didn't cross my mind. I didn't care where he was or what he'd become. That was his story to live with. Mine was just beginning, and I would write it exactly the way I wanted. As he stepped forward, the room seemed to shift, the noise of chatter and clinking glasses fading into a dull hum. He was tall, with dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples, sharp but kind eyes, and a faint smile that held no trace of condescension or pity, only interest. "Miss Davies," he said, extending his hand. His voice was deep, steady, and warm. "Your speech tonight was nothing short of inspiring." "Thank you," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I appreciate you coming out to support the cause." "I'm not just here to donate," he said, a hint of amusement glinting in his gaze. "I wanted to meet the woman behind Alara's light. Your story, well, let's just say it resonated." I arched an eyebrow, curious. "Have you been blindsided by betrayal, too?" "Not personally," he said with a small chuckle, "but I've seen what it does to people. My sister went through something similar years ago, different circumstances, same devastation. Watching her rebuild her life was the hardest thing she ever did. She could have used a foundation like yours." I studied him, intrigued by the sincerity in his words. He wasn't just here for show. He understood the pain that fueled my mission. "I'm glad she found her way through it," I said softly.
She did.
"But it took a long time," he admitted. "Your foundation is going to change lives, Alara." Hearing my name spoken like that, gently, without judgment, caught me off guard. It had been a long time since I'd felt so seen, so respected. "And you are?" I asked, suddenly realizing I hadn't learned his name. He smiled, unbothered by my forwardness. "Michael Whitaker. I work in real estate development. Most of my life's been contracts and buildings, but this is a real legacy." "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker," I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Hearing that means more than you know." "Michael," he corrected, his expression softening. "And if you don't mind, I'd like to help more than just writing a check." I'm in a position to offer space, offices, facilities, whatever your foundation might need to grow. Surprise flickered through me. That's incredibly generous. He shrugged slightly, as if it were no big deal. Women like you, Alara, you don't just survive. You thrive. And watching you turn your pain into something so powerful, that's something worth supporting. I blinked, his words settling over me like a bomb. For so long, I'd fought to prove my strength, to others, to myself. But here was someone who saw me for exactly who I'd become, without needing to tear me down or pick up my pieces. I'd love to discuss that further, I said finally, shaking his hand again. Thank you, Michael. Whenever you're ready, he replied. No rush. As he stepped away, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The night moved on, more handshakes, more smiles, but Michael Whitaker lingered in my thoughts. Not because I needed saving, not anymore, but because he represented something I hadn't let myself consider for a long time. The possibility of something new, something better.